I'm going to give you a chronological history of UFOs right from the beginning. So I think you understand how this whole phenomenon has progressed over the years. It's really a part of a chapter out of my UFOs Over Pennsylvania book entitled, Do You Know, Should You Know? Because if you're interested in this, you should know the facts about UFOs. So I'm going to take you through history right now, and we're going to go in chronological order. And you will learn something with this presentation, absolutely. So this is everything I know about UFOs in date order. Okay, there are 250 billion galaxies out there with an average of 200 billion stars. That's a 5 with 23 zeros after it. Okay, that's the number of stars in the universe. And any mathematicians, statistics, probability, most people who are into physics will tell you mathematically there has to be life in the universe. And nearly every poll that's taken, it's around 80% of people say that they believe there's life out there somewhere. The question is, how do they get here? And because we're not advanced enough, we don't understand how you can travel light years. But that's the only question, and it's really our ignorance. It's not them, because they're already here and they're doing it, you know? So we move along to 6000 BC. So that's 8,000 years ago. The oldest written language we have is ancient Sumerian. That's in Iraq. That's 8,000 years old. And the oldest religion we have is Hindu in India. So they're both 8,000 years old. That's the oldest written language, oldest religion. In that Sumerian language, they talk of the word Astra, means terrible airborne weapon. Think about that, written 8,000 years ago. Both Sumerian and Hindu texts talk about the ability to fly in Vimanas, which are flying craft, flying ships, and the terrible nuclear exchange that took place 8,000 years ago. Now, what you can do is reference the Zayan or the Maharabat. It's a hard word to say. What's it? Mahabharata. That's my version, but I know it's not said that way. But there's a couple of paragraphs in there that, if you read it, it clearly describes a nuclear exchange. These two leaders were arguing, and they fired what the people called lightning bolts. But the description written 8,000 years ago describes a terrible bright light that blinded people, shook the ground. Miles away, pottery fell off the shelves and broke. Anybody close enough was killed and severely burned. The further out you got from the explosion, the less the damage was. And just think, what are we describing here? The soldiers and people that were closest to it were jumping, and the horses were jumping into lakes and streams to get the burning off of them. They said their nails fell out, their hair fell out, they got sick, they died. Any food in the area was poisoned and you would die from it. So they didn't know how to describe this thing in India. It was in Mohenjo-daro, which is now actually in Pakistan, but that was all India back then, 8,000 years ago. So that was their description. And you cannot read those paragraphs and say that this is not a nuclear explosion. It's exactly what it was. And the way they concluded that section of it was that when they saw what they did and how terrible it was and how many people died, they vowed never to use that weapon again against human beings, and they left. And that's what it says in the Mahabharata. That's the correct, Mahabharata is the correct pronunciation. So, like I said, you can't read that. Then what happened was, when we located in Mohenjo-daro, the grave sites, when they were dug up, the skeletons were 50 times more radioactive than they should be. And it was almost like Pompeii, where people, you know, they died covering their kids. It almost was like Pompeii as far as what it looked like. But to me, the key was it was 50 times more radioactive than normal corpses are that are found, you know, 8,000 years later. So it clearly indicates that we may not have been the most advanced civilization on this planet. As a matter of fact, Oppenheimer, and I may actually get to this later in here, but we're talking about it now. After Oppenheimer was involved in the Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb, he was at, I think, Rochester University, just giving a speech, and the reporters asked him, what was it like the first time an atomic bomb was detonated on Earth, the first time in history? And his answer was, it wasn't the first time, and he referenced India and the Mahabharata. So he knew that there was ancient knowledge, and we were not the first to have nuclear weapons. So, and like I said, you know, last year I talked about the ancient alien stuff. If you look at our past, you understand that, you know, we didn't just go from cavemen to humans 10,000 years ago. What I was taught in high school was total garbage, you know. But that's what we were told. 10,000 BC, we were half cavemen people that all of a sudden started advancing and getting smarter. But I don't see anybody getting smarter. I'd say we're de-evolving right now, you know. So based on that, we should be really geniuses right now. What's that? That's right. Well, yeah, if we go with Congress, then we'd certainly de-evolved. But so let's just proceed through time. That was 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BC. Then if you look in Egypt, Abydos, A-B-Y-D-O-S, Egypt, in 2600 BC, there are carvings made in 2600 BC that show 6 craft. Clearly a helicopter, an airplane, a boat. I mean, you look at it and it is what it is. and that was 4,600 years ago. So you got to just follow me along through time. Okay, now we're at 596 BC, Ezekiel. It's in the Bible. And he describes seeing a wheel inside a wheel, and the faces moved with the wheel. And if you read that whole section, he's clearly talking about a UFO encounter. I think there were 3 or 4. And wheel spinning, you know, counterclockwise, faces in the windows. He goes into the craft, and you know, I read that he came out of the craft with the knowledge of how to make steel, because they only had iron back then. So, you know, I think that clearly talks about a UFO. 329 BC, Alexander the Great was making his march into India, crossing India. I don't know the name of the river he got to. He's got thousands of troops there, elephants, horses. And it's in his journal. He's encountered by 2 UFOs. They describe the craft swooping down at them, like keeping them from advancing into India. The elephants, the horses just turned, half his troops turned, and that stopped his advance into India. And that's in his journal. That, you know, he didn't call them UFOs, some sort of flying, whatever they might say, flying shields came down and repelled us from entering. Now, if you read this whole thing, the extraterrestrials seem to have a liking for India. Not that they exploded an atomic bomb there, but, you know, that's where the Vimanas were, and the craft. And we'll get into, I don't want to jump ahead, but I'll tell you more about India. But it seemed to me in reading this that they seem to have a liking for India, the country. Okay, now we go, I'm leaving Jesus for later. So we jump for 329 BC to 312 AD. Constantine, preparing for a large battle, October 28, 312, he sees a craft in the sky that has the sign of the cross on it. He gets so inspired, and his troops get inspired, and they talk about this flying thing in the sky, and they win the battle. That battle they win solidifies Christianity, and Constantinople, and it really makes Christianity the religion for Europe, and I guess at the time that was Turkey where Constantinople was. But that's described also by Constantine. And that was an important time because that made Christianity the official religion, at least for the European area. Okay, now we're at 1000 AD, and they find these trinkets in Central America. They think they're gold bugs. And there's a bunch of them carved out of gold 1,000 years ago, and they're displayed at the Smithsonian Institute. And they were there. Giorgio wears one on his lapel pin on Ancient Aliens, you know. It's not a little airplane. And they were at the Smithsonian until an engineer took it, created a wooden model, flew. I think he actually put an engine on it too, a little, you know, with a rubber band type engine, the thing flew. And then they said, you know what, if this was a bug, it wouldn't have a rudder. because the back of it, you know, it has that L-shaped rudder. I don't know any bugs that have rudders. And you know what's interesting? As soon as he came out and said that, Smithsonian pulled it off the shelves. They no longer sell it. They took them out of display. You will not find them at the Smithsonian. So there's absolutely a cover-up going on because they don't think you can handle the truth, and you have to just be happy with Dancing with the Stars, your iPads, and McDonald's. As long as you, and I'm telling you, that's the way our politicians look at you. If you got fast food, you got an iPhone or smartphone, and you got Dancing with the Stars, you don't need to know anything else. And that is absolutely the truth. And I can go into this for hours and hours as to, and prove that to you, that there's no regard for you. And if there was anything that's going to happen, they're not going to tell you either. You know, whether if there's an asteroid strike, if anything's going to happen, they're going to be in those deep underground military bases. You're going to be up top fending for yourself. And I can prove that to you also. Okay, now we're at 1492, Columbus. Columbus is drifting to the southwest. You know, he didn't really land. You know, people used to say, oh, Columbus discovered America. He discovered the Americas. He didn't actually land like at Plymouth Rock or anything like that. This guy is drifting terribly southwest, right? In his journal and his navigator, they see a UFO. It's a bright, almost like these orbs that we're getting right now. You know, he sees it, and he goes, all right, let's take a little bit of a turn here to the east, northeast, and he lands, okay? Otherwise, he would have ended up in Aruba. Maybe he would have preferred that, I don't know. But he was drifting. And it's in his journal, it's in the navigator's journal, and that's where he turned, and it was like, I don't know if it was 3 days later, that's where he landed. So again, you got a description of an object that appears to be a UFO. The first recorded UFO in the United States was at Charles River, Boston, Massachusetts, March of 1639, by the governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop. That's the first documented UFO recorded in the United States. The first crop circle, where's Jen? Are you in the room? Jen, she should know this. The first reported crop circle, because Jen's into crop circles, 1678 in the UK. And they referred to it as the mowing man, because they didn't know how they would. My question was, did they have lawnmowers back then? But they referred to it as the mowing man in 1678. So I guess they had a way of chopping the grass or something. But so you got the 1600s were the first documented cases of, in the newspapers, that is, because like I said, these other guys put it in their journals. 1778. So we're moving forward here in time. George Washington's journal. He reports 3 meetings with green-skinned natives at Valley Forge. All 3 times they give him coordinates of the British troops, because Washington was a terrible general. He was losing. He was getting his butt kicked. He really, it's amazing how the guy turned out to be the father of the country and everything. He was really, he lost most of his battles and was not doing very well. So he records in his journal that these green-skinned Indians 3 times met with him in the woods in Valley Forge and told him the British are there, dummy, not over there. And he escapes. There wasn't a battle. I don't think there was a battle at Valley Forge. I think he just got out of Valley Forge and saved his neck. But people nowadays talk about it and they say, you know, that green-skinned native, they weren't green-skinned natives. Those were extraterrestrials appearing as Indians, let's say, so he would accept them. 1917, you've all heard of the Red Baron in Germany. He described shooting down a 100-foot silver disc in the sky over France and actually seeing it land and occupants get out of it. You can look it up, the Red Baron, 1917. 1917 is an interesting year. Okay, so now 1917, you also have the Fatima, Portugal, right? I'm not sure how you pronounce that, Fatima. 50,000 witnesses. They witness 2 large shining discs dancing in the sky. They said the sun was dancing around the sky, because we didn't know how to describe these things back then. So it's dancing around the sky. Right after that, there's the apparitions of the Virgin Mary. And what's described, it was a rainy day, 50,000 people there. The object swooped down and the heat from it like dried everybody's clothes off. Everybody was soaking wet, swooped down, they got hit with a burst of warm air, a couple of times dried them all off. So, you know, I didn't know about this until a couple of years ago. I was talking at an Ohio MUFON conference, and this like 88-year-old guy comes with his walker, comes over to me, and he says, here's a book, read this. He said, did you know that Fatima was a UFO encounter? I said, no, I didn't know that. I read it, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in that book. So that may be what you actually saw there, and the way we accept it is they portray themselves as somebody else. Then there's a whole controversy over the three secrets, too. What were those three secrets? We know the first two was that World War I would end shortly. World War I would end shortly. The second secret was that if Russia doesn't accept Christianity, they will become a threat to the world, which happened until 1989-ish, let's say, until the fall. Even though Russia outlawed religion, there's a lot of religion in Russia, so it never worked outlawing religion in Russia. But they never said what the third secret was. And a couple of years ago, coming out and saying that the third secret was...
That envelope was supposed to be open this year.
No.
They haven't posted.
I thought it was 62. It wasn't the...
In my mother gets all this
Okay.
religious things, and they were supposed to reveal what that was
Yeah.
this year, but
Never. Well, they're not going to tell you the truth anyhow, so it doesn't matter. It's like when Britain and France, when these countries open up their UFO files, what do you think? You're getting the best cases? You're not getting them. But what they did do, I thought it had said 1960 it was supposed to be revealed to the world. And what they ended up saying a few years ago was that third secret was a description of a man dressed in white, the Pope, covered in blood. So they said the third secret was the shooting of Pope John Paul II. Yeah. That's not what it was. That wasn't the big secret that they couldn't come out and tell people. So whatever the third secret is, it's obviously very disturbing. But again, you weren't told, you never were going to be told. So now you got this whole thing that maybe Fatima was UFOs that came down. So what happens in 1918? It's in that same area, Spanish flu, right? Can you imagine living at that time? Sometimes I walk through graveyards. There's one right actually behind my house, and I'm very comfortable with it there. It's quiet and good neighbors. But I walk through and I look at the headstones. So many say 1917, 1918. So I was always thinking World War I. They died 22 years old, 21 years old, 19 years old. Then I see the 1918 tombstones. So many people, a lot of kids and all of that. 50 million people. That's a minimum estimate of what died with the Spanish flu around the world. So it paled World War I. Okay, the number of deaths from Spanish flu, and it was all over the world. How did it spread so quickly when you didn't have today's airline industry? And a lot of people are now saying that maybe that was brought in by those UFOs. It could have been a virus they carried or brought in from outer space. And that's how some of the bubonic plague, the Spanish flu, that's how those pandemics spread. They're from outer space. It's not like somebody cut down a rainforest and there it was, the fungus that turned into something. You know, that's not how that goes. So there, you're into 1918 now. Now let's talk about 1942. Most people say that you know, the UFO era started in 1947 with Roswell. I've always disagreed with that. I say it's 1942 with the Battle of LA. And you know, people are skeptical, oh, the Battle of LA. Look into the Battle of LA. It's 3 months after Pearl Harbor, so people say, well, they were just edgy and anything coming in was going to be, they were worried that, you know, the Japanese were attacking. But when you look at 1942, there was 9 or 11 discs coming in from the Pacific, picked up on radar, seen by the military, seen by civilians. 3 in the morning, they turn the air raid sirens on LA. They black out LA from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m., whatever time the sun came up. So you got 1 million people that are waking up by these air raids. They've got these UFOs flying into Los Angeles. They open up fire on it. 1,433 rounds they fire at this UFO. There's a great picture out there of a dome-shaped craft. You can see it, and if you look at the negative, it clearly is the dome-shaped craft, like Kecksburg, like so many of the other descriptions. The anti-aircraft fire is all around it. They're hitting it. They can't bring it down. 6 people died that night. 3 are hit by the shrapnel and get killed. 3 die of heart attacks. Maybe 3 a day die of heart attacks anyhow in LA. I don't know. There's a couple million people there. That might be the average. But 6 people died that day. 3 were hit by shrapnel. So, of course, like usual, back then they didn't know what they were dealing with. The front page newspaper, Los Angeles Times, you can look it up. It's great. You know, it's like the Roswell newspaper. And there we go. Battle of LA with flying saucers. And a couple of interesting things develop. Then the following day, it comes out, the general, they changed their story, right, because they didn't have a CIA back then, and they say, well, it was a weather balloon. Yeah, they launched 6 weather balloons 13 hours earlier. Those were over Sacramento somewhere. They were not in Los Angeles anymore. So Roswell was not the first time the weather balloon excuse was used. It was the Battle of LA. Battle of LA was the first time we fired on UFOs. Battle of LA was the first time we denied their existence. So to me, Battle of LA is the start of the UFO phenomenon. Then, a couple of days later, a memo from General George Marshall sends a memorandum out that a saucer was recovered off the coast and it is not earthly. That's his words. Okay, so now, in my mind, that's the start of the modern UFO period. You've all heard of Foo Fighters? Not the band. All right, Foo Fighters. That was a description given by Lieutenant Roman Sabinski, March 25th, 1942, off the coast of Holland, when he saw these orbs shadowing his craft. And when you go and you look at that whole Foo Fighter phenomenon, the German records say this must be an American weapon or probe. The American records say this must be a German weapon or probe. There you got confirmation that they don't know what it is, right? They both think it's each other's. So what is this thing that's tailing our craft and observing and all of that? But that was the start of the Foo Fighter phenomenon. So 42 to me is really the start of it, not 47. I'm actually tired of hearing about Roswell, but because too much is placed on that one incident. Okay, 1944, we're fighting World War II. The Allied forces, the Germans, were fighting each other, anti-aircraft guns going back and forth at our planes, at each other. An egg-shaped UFO shows up over Loreto, Italy. You can look it up. Both forces turn, Americans and Germans, the only time we cooperated until the end of the war when they realized they were losing. The Allies and the Germans both turn and fire at the UFO. That's documented over Loreto, Italy, June of 1944. Now Hitler, that's a whole another story. Into the occult, there's a whole story with him. He had his SS involved in this stuff before World War II started in the 38 and 39, sent his SS out looking for the Ark of the Covenant, the Spear of Destiny, down to Antarctica, wanting to get an arrangement with the Vril Society. I mean, there's a whole storyline there with Hitler. But let's get to the Bell Project. 1945, it's getting towards the end of World War II. They've got the Bell Project. Hitler takes the 62 scientists, engineers, and prisoners that worked on the Bell Project, which I think was in Czechoslovakia, and they kill them all to keep it quiet. They murdered all of the people involved in the Bell Project. The Bell was an object that you put red mercury in, you spin it, it spins in opposite directions, and there's, I think it's 250,000 psi, spun at 50,000 RPMs, and it glows, it emits radiation, and it defies gravity. There's old black and white film of a model they were using that would go up and hit the ceiling. And that was the anti-gravity stuff that Hitler was working on. So they killed all the people involved in it. Kammler is the head of all of this, and he's got all the records and all the information on that. So what happens? You're at the end of World War II. Kammler they have these junket 390s, gigantic, like 767s. There were two of them, and they were huge. And he's told to bring the 767 up to Berlin, probably to evacuate Hitler, and there's only two of them. He says no. Well, he probably didn't answer, but he doesn't do it. He loads it up with all of their secret programs, and he flies. Nobody knows where Kamala goes. But they have agreements with Argentina. In '39, they were down, bought a swat of land for New Swabiland, New Germany is what it is, down in Antarctica, agreements with Juan Perón. But Kamala disappears. So he either goes to South America or he cut a deal with the Americans, because he's mentioned one time in the Nuremberg trials, never prosecuted, his name comes up one time. Guy disappears. So he either gave us everything for, and he's living in Vegas, I don't know. But, or he went, because the Hitler's group were looking to, had a fallback plan in Argentina. So that's the story of Hitler and Kamala. President Juan Perón issues 1,000 patents to Nazi scientists that went to Argentina after World War II. And it was all, circular craft, engines, that type of stuff, based on what secret programs they were working on. You've probably heard of Leonard Stringfield. MUFON has the Stringfield files, which you could go see. I think it's open to members, but you have to go in person, which now we moved from Cincinnati to Southern California, better location, but we have his files. In there, Leonard Stringfield was at Iwo Jima, and he looked out his window from the C-46 he was in. He saw 3 teardrop-shaped UFOs. That's what got Leonard Stringfield involved in ufology. He saw it out his window before he landed in Iwo Jima for the fight, and he was lucky to survive because we lost 3,000 troops the first day. Think about that. It took the whole Iraq war about 8 years to lose 3,000 Americans. We lost that in one day. So it was totally different back then, but he survived, and that's what got Leonard Stringfield involved in ufology. I read a quote that the A-bomb, when we detonated that, right, got their attention. Now they start taking us serious. That's when we started seeing them more often, and we started taking them serious. When we detonated the A-bomb, they knew the hydrogen bomb was coming next, and nuclear weapons and technology was coming. And it's not a coincidence they show up, at Roswell, where the only nuclear base in the world is. And we'll get to more of that. I don't want to jump ahead, but so we have the first. Now we have the first nuclear reactor in 1945 in Hanford, Washington. So what happens? 4 UFO encounters documented from 1945 to 52. The UFOs are checking out the first nuclear reactor in the world at Hanford, Washington. We're at August 11th, 1946. The Swedes describe 200 ghost rockets. That's what they call them. They'd see these flying craft coming over Sweden, 200 of them. And they were UFOs, but they didn't know what to call them. They called them ghost rockets. Sweden also is the only European country that has a UFO memorial. In Ängelholm, Sweden, actually a hockey player up there, Götze Karlsson, claims to have encountered aliens who gave him natural cures in May of 1946, and he opens a pharmacy. So they have a UFO memorial there in Sweden. Okay, everybody knows the Roswell story. But the answer given by the Air Force is that the bodies seen at Roswell, well, it was a mogul balloon, top secret, and there were test dummies used. Okay, except what's described is, like a 4-foot, him, is what's described. Now here's the interesting thing. When Stanton Friedman does the research on the test dummies were not used until 1952. So the excuse they gave, because Roswell died. It didn't come out again until 78, 79 with Stanton Friedman. So some genius, at the NSA or CIA says, those are test dummies. But he didn't look it up. Test dummies weren't used till 52. So the test dummies were not used at Roswell. Usually when you look into the excuses, you can find out that they're incorrect. Now here's something interesting. So if UFOs are not real, the day after the Roswell crash, New Mexico Senator Dennis Chavez flies to Washington, has a private meeting with Truman. Chavez returns or calls all the Roswell media and threatens them that they will pull their broadcasting license if they continue to talk about the crashed UFO story. And that's documented. So if it's a weather balloon, why are we threatening all the news outlets not to talk about UFOs? Now, July 18th, we're still in 1947. A couple more things happened. 47 is a pivotal year. I like 42, but 47, July 18th, 1947, memo from the Air Force to J. Edgar Hoover asking the FBI to get involved in UFO investigations. The memo's out there, Google it. And Hoover's reply, handwritten on the memo, mailed back to the general who asked him from the Air Force. He says, we would get involved, but first I want access to the disc that crashed at LA, which is probably Los Alamos. Some people think it might be the 1942 Battle of LA disc. It just says LA. So here you got J. Edgar Hoover and the general talking about UFOs, which don't exist. Very interesting. So now everybody's worried. What do? They get together. The White House has a staff meeting, etc. July 1947, they create the National Security Act. It creates the CIA, the National Security Council, the Defense Department, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is weeks after the Roswell crash. Maybe it's a coincidence. September of 47, the Air Technical Intelligence Center issues a report concluding that flying saucers are real. So we should really get some of these documents and just put them together in a timeline and show how many times did they talk about it, how many times did they say it's real. It's all out there, and I'm trying to give you this in chronological order. Now we're into 1948. Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg suppresses 300 UFO reports because he concludes that they are threats to national security. So, they're starting to realize maybe we can't tell the public about this. And it's already a group put in place to start, investigating UFOs. So 1949, they call it Project Grudge, and it's kind of interesting. I like that one. That's the second group that's put together to investigate. And the reason they call it Project Grudge is that the Air Force didn't want it. They tried to give it to the Navy, and the Navy said, nope, here's the congressional memo, says you investigate UFOs. They took it back and called it Project Grudge because they didn't want it. And that's how it got named, that's how they got named Project Grudge. 1951, Gordon Cooper. He's probably a low-level military guy. He's in West Germany, he's a pilot, and he sees UFOs, multiple UFOs over the US Air Base in West Germany. Then, a couple of years later, in '57, he's handed an envelope with photos of a UFO that landed May 3rd, 1957 at Edwards Air Force Base. He looks at them, and then he forwards them to DC. And you can get YouTube video of him talking about it. It's all documented. He saw it once in '51. He saw pictures in '57 at our Air Force Base. They landed. And I think he said they had three legs that landed on the craft, that is, not on them. He's got two legs. My room last night, I had 2 double beds. Who do you think was in the other one? But let's see. Don't read anything into that. February 1952. Here's an interesting. The USS Philippine Sea is tracks on radar, and there's eyewitnesses of a UFO traveling 1,800 miles an hour, stops, goes the other way. This is all documented. And what's interesting, that same USS Philippine, a lot of times these same ships have encounters with UFOs. And I'm probably jumping ahead, but that same ship, the USS Philippine, was the one that Admiral Byrd took in Project High Jump down to Antarctica, supposedly to look and see if we could put a military base in Antarctica when the winter comes. Is it feasible to have a military base there? Others say, well, okay, You went down there with 7 craft, the USS Philippine aircraft carrier, and 4,700 troops. What he was looking for was the Nazis that escaped, their base in Antarctica, and it's a 2-year project that lasts 6 months. They encounter casualties. He does an interview in Chile with the El Mercurio newspaper where he says, quote, "They have the ability to fly pole to pole and an attack on the US could be imminent." That's what he said. It's in the newspaper, El Mercurio in Chile. You guys don't have to write this down. You just have to buy my book because it's all in there. It's about page 450. There's a chapter in there. Do you know? Should you know? You know, I was in charge of public affairs at UPS for 3 states, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia. And our head of public affairs, he'd come to our meetings and he'd say, you know, do you know this about Congress? Do you know that? Do you know? Should you know? That's where I got that phrase from, you know, because it's things you had to know, because we would deal with the congressmen and the senators and on our issues at UPS. But I like that phrase, do you know, should you know? And you really should. And if you're interested in this, you really need to know some of this stuff. So let's see, now I lost my place and I have to find it again. Okay, we're talking about the USS Philippine. Okay, so now let's talk about 52. 52 is another hugely pivotal year in ufology. So I think it's like May of 52 that they start Project Blue Book. So they get together with Dr. Condon, and they're going to do these investigations on UFOs. So now Grudge turned into Project Blue Book in 52. Okay, MUFON comes together in 52 also. We knew at this point that these investigations were bogus. So it was 4 guys get together in Indiana. We said, we're going to do private investigations. We didn't really know December of 52, or maybe we did know that Blue Book would be ended. I'm sure there were plenty of announcements. But so they get the first report given by the scientist to Dr. Condon. He reads it, he discards it, throws it away, and writes his own conclusion that UFOs are not real. The 19 scientists that did the investigations and wrote the report resigned from Project Blue Book. Think about that. You know, I'm giving you a timeline here of things that actually happened. Then in 52, this is important, you have the UFOs over DC. I think does everybody know about that? The 2 weekends in July, UFOs flew over DC, but there's a whole backstory to that. They hold this huge press conference, and matter of fact, President Truman in the morning, President Truman, this is documented, would receive quarterly UFO briefings from General Robert Landry. The copies of those briefings are in Landry's biography at the Truman Library. Every 3 months he got a briefing from this general on UFOs. They said the 52 sightings, 1952 sightings over DC were heat inversions. Well, this Captain Ruppelt, who to me this guy is a real honest guy. He's one of the heroes of ufology. He comes out and says no. He said the heat inversions were not strong enough to be picked on radar, so they were not heat inversions. So he goes up against what the Air Force has said. Ruppelt now is heading up Project Blue Book. He's in charge of Project Blue Book. He disagrees that the UFOs over DC were just like a mirage, you know, heat reflecting, cars reflecting off the heat that looked like they're in the sky. You know, that's not, he says that's not what it is. Ruppelt at that point changes the word from flying saucers to UFOs. So he coins the phrase UFOs. He writes his own book. Okay, in his book, he describes all this UFO stuff going on. The second edition that comes out, he's pressured by the Air Force to change the ending of the book to say UFOs are not a threat to national security. He does that. Maybe they said you don't get a pension. I don't know. He changes it from saying that UFOs are dangerous, they're a threat, we don't know what they are, to UFOs are not a threat, because that's what they want you to believe, that you're all safe. All these abductions, the 250,000 missing people reports in the United States a year are nothing but runaways and kidnappings, you know. 30,000 of which are never solved. We never find those people every year. That's a whole nother topic. So he changes the end of his book. He's 37 years old. 6 months after changing the end of his book, he dies of a massive heart attack. And I can give you a dozen people who died 20 years before they should, who are pro-UFO and came out on the topic. So, so they have July 29th, really, these took place July 14th, I think it was the 21st and the 28th, or the 14th and 21st were the sightings over DC. That morning, President Truman's pissed. He issues an order, and it's still a standing order, that whatever these are, it's an order to shoot them down if they cannot be talked down. That's his order. I can just see the pilots now. Okay, how am I going to communicate with them? Did I speak English? You know, how am I going to tell these guys you got to land or I'm going to shoot? That's his order. Now get this is the morning of July 29th. The afternoon of July 29th, General Sanford holds a press conference and they come out and say UFOs are not a threat to national security. It was nothing but heat inversions. We get these kind of reports all the time. We don't know what UFOs are. So they went to, after what Truman said, they came out and said the opposite that same day in the afternoon. Okay, we developed the first nuclear aircraft carrier in 1950, the USS FDR. And if you ever watch any of those shows, there's a lot of them talk about the FDR and all the UFO encounters it's had. They pick these craft that are nuclear, just like the nuclear reactors, etc. The FDR has nuclear encounters in 52, 53, 56, 58, and 62. Okay? The other aircraft carriers that are not nuclear carriers, they don't have the encounters with UFOs. Now we get to 1953, they changed the name again, now it's the Robertson Panel. Memos come out in 1958 that the Robertson Panel was sponsored by the CIA with the goal to debunk UFOs. And there's one thing I missed, and that's where I was hesitating before, was the Robert Lowe memo. Let me write that down, Robert Lowe memo. Robert Lowe was one of the guys on Condon's staff in 1952. Were you able to hear me before? Because it sounds a lot louder now. It was okay? Okay. Robert Lowe was on Condon's staff in 52 when Blue Book starts. He sends a memo to Dr. Condon stating, it's called the trickery memo, that he says we have to, and you can look it up, we have to let the public think we're actually investigating UFOs when all the time we're not, and we're just going to give the appearance that we're doing the investigation when we really don't expect and want to find anything to this. That's what it says. One of the office people, probably one of the 19 scientists that quit, leaks the memo to the public. Good for him. You know, but that's what we were dealing with back then. So it was all a whitewash back then. I was thinking, I knew I had missed something in my notes here. So the Robertson Panel is run by the CIA now. CIA is in place, and their goal is to calm the public down, debunk UFOs. In the CIA documents that came out in '58, they went as far as saying that we recommend that book reports done by kids in school, if they're on UFOs, they don't get credit for it. That's how deep they were thinking. Seriously, think about it. The CIA is all about psychology. Human behavior, how to trick people, psychology. That's their recommendation. If you read Captain Ruppelt's book and write a UFO book report, you're not to get credit. That was a recommendation. It was incredible. I mean, they're real good. CIA, you know, they're real good, but they kind of like operate, but let's operate overseas. That's what your job is. FBI is domestic, CIA's overseas. Do it on them. Don't do it on us. But they do. Okay, we're still in 1953, November 23rd, 1953. An F-89C Scorpion jet is scrambled from Kinross Air Force Base to intercept a UFO on radar. They have the UFO, they got the fighter jet, they merge, the UFO keeps going, no sign of the fighter jet or the pilot and the crew. It's documented, you can look it up. And there's been many, many encounters like that. 1954, General Twining. There's a memo sent to General Twining. It's called the Twining Memo, And the conclusion, you can look it up, the conclusion is UFOs are real, they're not of this earth, you know, then he describes characteristics of it. Who do you think releases the Twining memo in '54? Captain Ruppelt. Even though he's the head of the Project Blue Book, he's the guy that wants to prove it. And that's '52, '54. Condon, we talked about, that was later. Okay, that was really towards the end of Project Blue Book. Here's something interesting too, and I put this in the MUFON Journal. I put an all-points bulletin out for any military officers that served in the 1950s that were a UFO officer. I got 2 replies. All military bases in the 1950s had UFO officers. And if you reported a UFO, they assigned you, said, go see the guy in the back with the hat, he's our UFO officer, and there were memos referring people to the UFO officer. Now, why would they have a UFO officer in the 50s if there was no UFOs? And it's all part of the proof that really is made fun of and suppressed from people. Okay, now we get into our nuclear, well, not nuclear bases yet. Muroc Air Force Base, right? They shut it down February 19th to the 21st in '54. They shut Muroc Air Force Base down. That's Edwards Air Force Base in Palm Springs. They shut the base down. President Eisenhower disappears for 3 days. There's a AP press release, Eisenhower died of a heart attack. Nobody knows where Eisenhower is. He's at Muroc Air Force Base. Timothy Good, Phil Schneider investigate this. They got names of witnesses, etc., claiming that Eisenhower had a meeting with extraterrestrials at Muroc, February 20th, 1954. They were human, Nordic-looking ones, long white hair, tall extraterrestrials. They wanted us to give up our nuclear weapons. I can't verify this, but there are witnesses who say this. Read Timothy Good's book. And Eisenhower said he's not giving up our nuclear weapons because the Russians have weapons. Are you going to take theirs too? And why should we leave ourselves defenseless to you? So he says no, and he did the right thing. But they were offering technology. If you give up your weapons of mass destruction, we will give you technology to cure diseases, to anti-gravity, etc. Yes?
John, what's the name of Timothy Good's book?
Above Top Secret.
He has a second one out called Beyond Top Secret that came out in '96. I just finished reading it. It's really good.
Okay, and he does.
Either one is good, but that one
Yeah.
is the newer one.
I'd love to get him here, but I can't afford the $1,600 flight from England. I really can't. Okay, so now what happens is there's 2 more times that people claim that these meetings take place 6 months later in Holloman Air Force Base. I think the next 2 were at Holloman Air Force Base. 6 months after Muroc, 6 months again later after Holloman. And then what Phil Schneider says is this Creator Treaty is signed where we do agree to take some technology from them in exchange for something, which a lot of people say is to not interfere with whatever they want to do here, their research, their abductions, whatever they do. It's like, if they don't give it to us, they're going to give it to the Russians. If they don't give it to us, then the Russians are going to give it to the Chinese. So we, go to bed with the devil and say, okay, we're not going to do anything about UFOs. We're going to cover the whole thing up. We're going to laugh at anybody that talks about it. We're going to say it don't exist. If you write a book report, we're going to not give you a grade, but give me the technology. It's almost survival of the fittest. That's what Phil Schneider says. I don't know how to prove that, but that's, I'll call it folklore. But what I can prove from those memos I said is now we're in January of 1958. Major Kehoe, who's like Ruppelt, says UFOs are real. He writes a book, UFOs are real. He gets on CBS to talk about UFOs. It's a special. And on the show, he says that UFOs are under intelligent control. They pulled the feed on it, and the show went off the air. That's a fact. They pulled the feed on him. We're in 1958 now. DARPA is created, right? DARPA's goal is to engineer advanced technologies. You remember how the NSA and DARPA, you never heard of them. You heard CIA, FBI, right? NSA now is all out in the public with, you know, their spying and copying every email and text message. But DARPA is one you don't hear a lot about. They do all the advanced technology, Skunk Works, working with Lockheed Martin, et cetera. Formed in '58 with a goal of engineering advanced technologies. Why? Because we're getting some advanced technologies. We have a Roswell crash. We don't know what it is. We don't know how to use the stuff, you know. So DARPA is created. So you can see this timeline. Here's something interesting. 15 years after Kenneth Arnold saw the UFOs over Mount Rainier, he's interviewed in '62. And he concludes that at this point, after giving it a lot of thought and researching it, he says, I believe that these craft I saw were living creatures in our atmosphere with the ability to morph or change their form. I thought that was interesting. I've never seen a UFO. I did see a rod once. Those long rods that fly past about 90, 100 miles an hour. I just saw it thing go around. I looked at it. I said, this thing has got to be, you know, 6, 8 feet long. I just saw it fly past my house and move real quick. I wonder if it's that same type of thing. But his conclusion was that these were able to change. He thought they were alive, which back then he would say, well, though they're alive, well, they got some sort of technology that can change what they are. It wasn't that the craft, although you've had other people say the skin of the craft is alive, or, you know, like Peniston touched it in Bent Waters, and he got this whole message downloaded into his brain. So I thought that was interesting. And then I'm giving you all the little facts I've ever learned over the years in chronological order. Abductions. Audrey Hewins, you in here? She's out there talking to Travis. Okay. Abductions make up 0.2%. 1 out of every 500 cases MUFON receives, 1 out of 500 is an abduction. Identifiable cases are 80%. We can identify 80% of the cases when we investigate them. Satellites, meteors, the space station, airplanes, heat inversion, all of that stuff. I'd say about 10% are hoaxes from my experience, and then you get down to the last 9 or 10%, which 5% are incredible, and that's why you need to join MUFON. I need investigators, and seriously, we live for that 5% of cases that are just fantastic, that you know they're not making it up. You know, one of the things when I interview people, I was head of security for UPS. I've trained in behavioral analysis. I've taught people how to interrogate and get confessions and all of that. When I'm talking to you and you're describing it and you don't know what happened next, you made it up. How do you not know what happened next? You got to know everything that happened, right? So that's just one of the things I look at. But I'd say there's at least about 5% of the cases that are absolutely incredible. Okay, let's get to 1963 now. November 1963, what happens? Kennedy gets shot, right? But get this, and I don't know if they're related. 11 days before the assassination of President Kennedy, he issues 2 memos. And they're out there. Google them, Kennedy UFO memos. You can see them. The first memo says, I want all the UFO files on my desk by February of '54. Okay? It's out there. That's what it says. It's the Kennedy UFO memo. The same day, or maybe, I think it's the same day, he issues a memo to Khrushchev. I'm concerned that either you or I can misidentify a UFO as an incoming missile and start World War III. We're talking about something that don't exist, right? Those 2 memos are out there. You can read them. I don't know if they're associated with his assassination 11 days later. People say Kennedy was going to come out and tell the public the truth. That's why he wanted all the files, because it was real. I don't know if that was part of it or not. And maybe Bobby Kennedy, you know, they say the same thing, and they confided in Marilyn Monroe. I don't know if that's the whole deal. You know, I don't know that, you know, Castro or the Cosa Nostra killed the president. I don't know if that was the reason, but that's part of the folklore too. But the memos are absolutely out there. You can read the 2 Kennedy memos. So people say, how did they get here? We don't understand this technology. Okay, so where's the closest star that has planets, right? Alpha Centauri is 4.3 light years away, okay? So let's say, you know, they can't travel at the speed of light. They travel half the speed of light. It's 9 years to get here. It's very doable, you know? And I believe whatever creature is sent from the planet isn't the creature that lives on the planet. Because think about it, if we were going to send people to Mars right now, you 5 here in the front row probably can't survive that. But if it's 20 years from now, we can genetically engineer you or take a robot with your consciousness and stuff, that's what we're going to send, because he ain't going to die. So I don't think the grays and what you see is actually the creature that sent them here, because I don't think you can make that long trip. You can't do a 10-year round trip, a 3-generation trip. Yeah, and one of the things that happened too, I remember seeing video of the Russian cosmonaut that set the record for being in space. You remember that? I don't remember his name. It was probably 40 years ago. But I remember the video of him being taken out of the pod after whatever it was, 2 months in space circling, and he set the record. The guy was spindly, lost all his bone and muscle mass and couldn't walk. I looked at it and I said, there you go. Same thing happens to them when you're out in space for that long. Think about it. Without gravity, you lose your muscle mass, your bone density. Same thing. 3 generations, let's say it takes to get here, this is what you end up with. They started looking like, something like us. I don't know. That's just my crazy brain going. But I don't know. It's possible, though. Okay. The Star of Bethlehem. Everybody knows about the Star of Bethlehem with Jesus' birth, right? So astronomers looked into it and said, okay, where is this bright star over Bethlehem? No one's ever identified the Star of Bethlehem. They don't know what that was. It's not a star. 1964, the police officer, Socorro, New Mexico, right? He, probably know about that. He sees this UFO pod. I think it's one with 3 stilt-type legs on the craft. Goes down to investigate it. There's imprints it leaves in the ground. And this guy's a police officer. Excuse me. It leaves ground impressions, and it's filmed by Ted Jordan. It's sent to the Air Force, never returned, which is a common thing that happens with pictures and video. Same thing happened to Gordon Cooper. The pictures that he took, that he's viewed, he saw later, and were not the same pictures that, he didn't take those pictures. The pictures he saw of the UFO, he was either never shown those again or was shown different pictures. And that's happened with other astronauts that actually filmed UFOs and then were shown it and said, that's not the film I gave you, that's not it. But that's just another thing that happens. June 1966. A UFO hovers over Whiteman Air Force Base for 2 hours and shuts down the launch capabilities for 150 nuclear missiles. It's documented. It shut the system down. You can't launch the missiles. That Robert Lowe, here it is. That took place in August of 1966, was the Robert Lowe memo to Condon of how we're going to trick the public into believing we're actually doing something about this. That's 1966, and that's out there. And like I said, all those scientists, they resigned from Project Blue Book. March 24th, 16th, and 24th of 67, these are 2 of the famous ones you've heard of, the Malmstrom Air Force Base. Captain Salas, you've probably heard him talk about this. UFO shuts down 8 nuclear missiles at Malmstrom Air Force Base. There's no shut-off switch on Minutemen missiles. Actually shuts down the panel that controls the missiles. It's not the actual missile that shuts down. But, here you got the captain, and of course nobody nowadays believes him. I've met him. I've seen his presentation. Why are these guys in charge of nuclear bases if we think they're nuts? Think about it. The guy's got 8 nuclear warheads there, yet he sees this. And if you don't know the story, the guard shacks out there, they're underground, and they call down and say, hey guys, there's this big object hovering, it's red, it's glowing, it's about 50 feet in diameter. What do you want us to do? I don't know. So Salas is the captain, gets in charge, gets with the other guy. They call back and say, it's still here. Should I fire on it? No, that's the last thing you want to do. Don't fire on it. Shut the nuclear, and then it shuts down the control panel for the missiles. That's a true story. We're going to get him here to speak at one of our conferences also. This whole nuclear thing is astounding, what happens. But they go to the nuclear ships, the nuclear bases, the nuclear missiles. Roswell, where the first nuclear atomic weapon was where they went also. So now we're still in 67. That was March, July 67. They go over Minot Air Force Base. They start the launch sequence on the missile. This is true. They start the launch sequence at the Soviet Union. All right, we got to shut it down. So the protocol worked, we shut it down. 1967 also, President Carter, and the memos are out there, twice asked the Vatican for their UFO files. This is interesting, now the Vatican's involved in this, probably always have been. They asked the Vatican for their UFO files. The Vatican denies his request twice. Carter, you know, saw a UFO in 69. It's probably in my notes, so let's leave 69. I'm going in order here. October of 67, UFO crash at Shag Harbor in Nova Scotia. Canadian authorities acknowledge it's a UFO crash. First time Canada acknowledges a UFO crash. Okay, so now what do? We've had these secret committees, we've had meetings, the president gets briefed, et cetera, et cetera. We get to 1966. Congressman Gerald Ford has a wave of UFOs over Michigan. Alan Hynek says it's swamp gas. He doesn't buy it. And I think most of these critics, like the guy that was on Anderson Cooper, I really wanted to say this on air. I was hoping the swamp gas thing would come out of his mouth, and I'd say the only thing with swamp gas right now is you. I was going to say that on Anderson Cooper, but the opportunity didn't come up. It was in the back of my head. But that's the only swamp gas I know of. So what happens is, think about this now. I was going to say that, believe me. We got into it at the end of that, and a lot got cut out that was actually said. That show, half of what I said, everything that the skeptics said, Anderson Cooper said to me, John, what do you got? I gave him a good answer. Like he brought up the O'Hare Airport was a hole punch cloud. I probably got this in my notes, but you know, they cut out where I said hole punch clouds are a rare phenomenon, but you have to have freezing temperatures. What it is it's below 32 degrees, ice particles freeze, they drop through the cloud, create an opening in the sky, a round opening. They happen. 53 degrees that day. There was no hole punch cloud. But that's the excuses they throw out. They just throw anything out. It was a test dummy. Well, they weren't created for 5 years. How did it happen in Roswell? We didn't even have test dummies. All right, I might talk about this later. Let me keep going. So now think about it. Think about our Congress right now that's so polarized, so we know this is never going to happen. You, taking notes, you want to know about the Bigfoot invasion and what the Army plan is for that. They hold congressional hearings. You think that's going to happen? They're never going to happen, right? But what happens in 1966? Gerald Ford, Congressman Gerald Ford, he says, this ain't no swamp gas, you know, Jay Allen. He gets congressional hearings. They hold a congressional hearing on UFOs in April 5th, my birthday, 1966. That's not my year. I wish it was. But they hold congressional hearings in 1966. And who's in those congressional hearings? Rumsfeld attends. Do you know Rumsfeld has been in almost every administration from the 60s through Bush? Now, I got to give, on one point, I've always thought Rumsfeld was the gatekeeper on this UFO stuff. It's probably George Bush Sr. The only thing I changed my mind on Rumsfeld is that he did come out a few years ago, about 10 years ago, and say, we're missing about $2.3 trillion in black budget money that goes to probably the Air Force. And now I don't think he's the gatekeeper. He wouldn't have said that. But I've always thought that he was the guy that was high, because he went to all of these things, and he was in every administration. So now, not only in 1966 do we hold congressional hearings, we do it again in 1968. Carl Sagan's part of that one. Now, Sagan was kind of a debunker. Life in space, never been here, a SETI guy. You know, we should be sitting here sending radio waves that turn to white noise out to a point in the sky that represents like 0.001 of the universe, but that's the thing to do. And they get all kinds of funding, but yet we have all this evidence and documents and proof that they're already here, but we should be sending radio waves out. And they need money, and they get $200 million by Jodie Foster and Hollywood that makes a lot of money. MUFON's yearly donations, $20,000. That's why we do these conferences, so I can pay for my Geiger counters and investigations, because nobody's handing us millions of dollars. All those actors and Hollywood people that make all this money give us nothing. But they support SETI. It's incredible. I might get to this, but I'll say it now. SETI and NASA is the public view, all right? And I think we'll talk about this later. Think about what government does. They got you looking over here. What's really going on is over here. SETI, what do they got? How many millions of people belong to SETI online where you can sit there and listen to radio waves? Oh, okay, I'm part of this now, right? Big deal. What are you listening for? Static? You know, NASA. Obama shuts down the space program, right? The space shuttle. I challenge you to come up with a bigger and broader and more powerful thing to do, right? What happens, I know I have this in my notes, December of 2012, the Air Force lands the X-37B, a remote control drone of the space shuttle. Looks just like it. It's on the news, December of 2012. It was on the news for like that and went over everybody's heads, and they were saying, who's on Dancing with the Stars tonight? You know, where'd they get this thing from? They got a remote control drone of the space shuttle. Obama already knows the big thing that the NASA is going to be using next is a remote controlled space shuttle so we can go to Mars, because the Air Force is done with it. And now you can have it. And that's how it works. Okay. That's my opinion, but I believe that's how that works. Where am I now? Shag Harbor, congressional hearings. Okay, so they get 2 congressional hearings. Let me see you get congressional hearings today on anything. Not just UFOs. Get a congressional hearing on something that's, you know, especially something that's made up and doesn't exist. Okay, now we get to Senator Barry Goldwater. Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, you know where that term came from? Barry Goldwater. He said when he contacted General Curtis LeMay, he wanted access to the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I want to see the UFO evidence. It's out there. LeMay's response is, you cannot have access to the UFO room. It's above top secret. He didn't say there wasn't one. He says, you're just not getting into it, and don't ever ask me that again. And Goldwater said, hey guys, I tried, I just can't get access. I'm a senator, I can't get access. And that's where Timothy Good got the name of that book, Above Top Secret. It wasn't his term, it was Barry Goldwater. I wish we'd have a senator come forward nowadays and, you know, remember Kucinich in 08? He says, yeah, I saw a UFO on Shirley McLean's ranch. He was laughed off the stage. That pretty much ended his political career. Nobody comes forward nowadays and says they saw a UFO. Back then, they didn't know what they were dealing with. The protocols weren't there to suppress this. People were honest. They were still trying to find out the truth because they didn't know what they were dealing with. But all these committees behind the scenes are being put into place to suppress the truth. Okay, let's get 1968, true story, Vietnam. June 16th, 1968, we pick up UFOs on radar. We send our fighter jets up. We're chasing these UFOs in Vietnam out into the ocean. We open fire on them. They take off. Our missiles go. What do you think it hits? It hits the Australian destroyer HMAS Hobart. We hit it. True story, look it up. Our jets fired and hit the Australian destroyer while they were chasing UFOs. The general in charge, George S. Brown, who commanded the fleet that struck the Hobart 5 years later in '73, was quoted as saying, UFOs plagued us in Vietnam. We called them helicopters, but the North didn't use helicopters at that time. Brown went on to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, think about that. We struck an Australian ship thinking we were firing on UFOs. 1968 to 70, Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs. They have a Physics 370 class that they teach to their cadets in Colorado Springs. Chapter 33 is entitled UFOs. UFOs and the Threat, I think is the name of it. Chapter 33. You can get it, it's out there. I have a copy of it. In it, one of the paragraphs says, when people ask me how long they've been here, how many different species, well, back then, the Air Force believed, and it says in the book, they have been visiting Earth as long as 47,000 years, and there are 3 or 4 different species. That's what they were teaching their pilots in 68, 69, and 70. It's there. It's in their physics book. When Project Blue Book ended, December of '69, they report their conclusions. January of '70, UFOs are not a threat to national security. After 1970, the Air Force pulls that course from the physics book. So it was only taught for 3 years. But that's what they believed at that time. Okay. January 1972, we go back to Malmstrom Air Force Base. UFO over the Air Force Base. It's there, it leaves, it opens up the missile bay door. I think these things are like 250 tons. It opened the bay door. Okay? Again, it's Malmstrom they seem to like. All right, here's a story. 1973, Jackie Gleason, President Nixon, golf buddies, right? Gleason's always asking Nixon about UFOs. I want to see the Roswell bodies. I want to see the craft, all of that. So Nixon, he had a history of ditching his security and going out and partying and doing stuff. So he shows up at Gleason's house, picks him up in a private car. They go to Homestead Air Force Base. He shows Gleason the bodies and the craft of a UFO. And Gleason tells the story to his wife, who didn't divulge this until after Gleason died, but she said he was never the same. After seeing that, he was, first of all, stunned this was real, and what he said was, I can't believe the government keeps this from the public. That's a true story according to Gleason's wife. Okay, 1974, Governor Ronald Reagan's in his plane flying to Bakersfield. Both he and his pilot look out the left window. There's a UFO flying along with them. Okay? This is a true story. You can look it up. It's a fact. Reagan twice saw UFOs. November 1975, UFOs over Malmstrom Air Force Base again. All right? They changed the targeting information on a nuclear warhead from Moscow to New York. I don't know if that was it. Let's just say. We again jump in, shut it down, decode it. True story. Were they trying to start a war? Were they testing us? Are they here to observe how we react? Are they trying to deter us from using nuclear weapons? Or did they just want to start the big one and sit back and enjoy it because it's better than HBO? You know? Okay, 1977, NASA, right? They asked Congress to consider resuming UFO investigations. Congress declined, saying nothing would be gained. There are many documents out there where the U.S. asked the British, are you flying a new craft? Because we don't know what this is we're picking up on radar. Same thing, Brits ask us, hey, what are you guys flying? We got something here. It's not ours. Is it yours? They both say no. Just like the Germans and the Americans back in World War II, right? Foo Fighters, let's say, similar. So now we know it's not a secret craft, right? Because neither one of them, they both say it's not ours. So it's something else. So you almost got confirmation right there that there's something else flying around. I thought this was interesting. 1980, you probably heard of the Cash Lantern incident in Texas. They get out of the car, a UFO comes over them, they get burns, they later get cancer, die. A couple of days later was the Bentwaters, UK incident in England, Bentwaters. They were just a couple of days apart. Okay, let's talk about nuclear reactors. First time authorities acknowledged a UFO of a nuclear reactor was Hudson Valley, 1984. 300-foot UFO hovers over Reactor 3, June 24th, 1984, Indian Point nuclear reactor. The people in charge of the reactor acknowledged there's a UFO over the reactor. Get this. President Reagan's diary, dated June 11th, 1985. He notes that we have a space capacity for 300 crew. How many space shuttles do we have? Did we have? 5. How many can each one hold? Guarantee it's not 60, it's 8. So we have a space shuttle capacity to hold 40 at any given time, if you can put them all up at the same time. Reagan in his diary says we can hold 300, right? Think about McKinnon, the guy in England, found Project Solar Warden, large UFO craft run by the U.S. Space Command, right? That's what Reagan, see, Reagan knew the truth because he saw UFOs twice, and he was very slick in getting it out as a politician. And he put it in his diary. He said things 4 or 5 times to the UN about a threat from outer space. I think Reagan wanted us to know the truth. November 1986, Japan Airlines, Flight 1628, I think it was Paris to Tokyo, flying over Alaska. Ground radar picks up a UFO, the pilot sees it. You know, it's just flying alongside, it's gigantic, 600 feet. You know, it's flying, everybody sees it. The Callahan was the guy involved who comes forward from the FAA. He was told not to say anything around it. He briefs the president on this one. So the pilot of 1628, the Japanese pilot, files a UFO report. He then gets a desk job for telling the truth. 1989, Bob Lazar, controversial guy, right? Next year is the 25th anniversary. And who do we have next year? Maybe him, but we got George Knapp, who broke the story. George Knapp is going to talk about the 25 years of breaking Area 51 and Bob Lazar. So Bob Lazar, I don't know if he's a wacky guy. I don't know if, you know, they said his background and stuff wasn't real. Others say they purged his education, whatever. Lazar, actually, Knapp is telling me that Lazar may not come, but we may Skype him in, something like that. We'll see. But Lazar mentions element 115 at Area 51. He describes what it is. It's a propulsion element, etc., like that. 2004, element 115 is discovered, does exactly what Lazar says. So I find that interesting. Maybe Lazar was truthful. Here's a story came out of the Persian Gulf. January 24th, 91. A UFO is tracked on radar in the Persian Gulf by 3 U.S. and 2 British ships. All 5 open fire on it at the same time, hit it, and take it down in the Persian Gulf. That's in not John Mack. Some Mack is his last name. Talks about UFOs and war. It's a really good book. That's where I got some of this information on Vietnam, etc. 1992, Congress ordered NASA to search the universe for radio signals. So we're in 92 now. This started Project SETI. It lasts 1 year. There's no money for it like everything else. Even 20 years ago, there was no money. And they abandoned SETI. It becomes a private venture. And I already commented that everybody's behind SETI. Radio waves turn into white noise. So why are we doing this? It doesn't make any sense, you know, when we already got so much evidence that they're here, and we need to do real good investigations. You've all heard of John Mack, Dr. John Mack of Harvard, right? This is how he got involved in UFOs. 1992, he's at Harvard, psychiatrist. He's asked to evaluate Air Force and police officers that have had a UFO sighting. That was his job. He was asked, can you do this? Here's 20 of them. Sit down, find out what it is, right? He does that, and now he's hooked. Because the more you look, the more you find, because this is real. So now Mack, if you know the Mack story, you know, he writes some books. Harvard tries to get him kicked out of the college. Daniel Sheehan defends him. They get it all dropped. A few years later, Mack is in London. Cars are on the opposite side of the road. Steps off the curb, gets hit by a car. Another guy killed, another of the 20 I could name, killed 20 years before their lifespan should have ended by either fast-acting cancers, massive heart attacks, or suicides, or hit by car. Suicides for people that really weren't depressed, so. Do you know, Richard Lang, who's talking this afternoon, we were talking a couple of months ago, and I said, yeah, you know, we bought 3 Geiger counters for the group, and Lang's pretty well connected. Are you over here, Lang? Where are you? Or he's out there. He's outside. He worked for Homeland Security, all these other things. He was the head of MUFON's investigations. I said, we got 3 Geiger counters, right? We gave 1 to Bill Weber, 1 to Fred Saluga, 1 to me. And he goes, you know what you should do with that? I said, what? Go to your car and put it over the seat. Because when they want to get rid of somebody, they put a radioisotope under your seat, leave it there for a little while. You get fast-acting cancer, they come back and take it. I took that damn thing and went out there and put it, I'm doing my car seats, both of my vehicles. It wasn't radioactive. But you know what? Ask him how he knows that, because he didn't know I said that. So ask him why do they put radioactive isotopes under people's car seats? So there, he blew the whole thing. I finally got some technology, you know. I also this week got a monocular Generation 3. Let me tell you something. I walked into my backyard, pitch black, looked at it, looked like daylight. There's my Doberman running around. Can't see him, can't see him, can't see him. I pick a star, one star, look at it, whole sky is full of stars. Best thing you could ever see. So it's just a Generation 3 night vision. The one I got was a monocular one, costs about a third of what the PVS 14 costs, which is about $3 grand, $3,500. Okay, let's move on. So now I'm looking at all these numbers, statistics, Kepler's telescope, all of that, talking about what I said to you, the number of galaxies, the number of stars, the number of planets, like 3% are in the habitable zone, all of that. I come to the conclusion, based on all this information, there are more Earth-like planets in the universe than dollars in the national debt of 17 trillion. And that's true. Physicists will tell you that. Think of all those planets out there with life. 17 trillion. We have no idea how big the universe is, unless it's a hologram. It's not really there, which I've read that too. It's only a small solar system, couple of solar systems, and everything else isn't really there. It's a projection. Here's another story. Desert Storm, etc. A UFO is shown on CNN over Baghdad. I remember seeing this, December 16th of '98. It's hit by Iraqi forces and it's taken down, just like the 1976 one over Tehran. They said it landed, kind of had repairs or something, and then took off. Some people speculate maybe they turned it over to us or they have it to back engineer. Maybe that's why they're so bold. But the Iraq forces take down this UFO. They take it to the, I don't know how to pronounce this, Kalate Julundi research facility, and some people say this was the real reason for the Iraq invasion of 2003 was to recover the craft. Okay, but that craft was shown on CNN December 16th of '98. 3 times the Vatican have come out and spoken, said there's life in space. Most recently, Vatican chief astronomers Reverend Gabriel Funes in 2008 reiterated what Father Balducci in 2001 said, that it's arrogant for us to say that God and all his immanence would create one planet with life, that there is life in space. He's probably created life elsewhere. They're all our brothers. They've probably fallen from grace just like us. So they believe that there's life in space. This comes from the Vatican Observatory 3 times. I think the first time was in the 50s, and then most recently twice they've said that. It's not coming from the Pope, but they said it, and they've said it 3 times, and nobody's ever said that that's not, we don't, back what was said. Okay, give you a breakdown of close encounters, right? Everybody saw a close encounter of third kind, right? So you understand that's what that is. But a CE1 is when we get these lights in the sky, and they're moving fast, they're moving strange. That's a close encounter of the first kind. CE2 is where there's some sort of trace evidence. The Bucks County case, remember that one with Denise? Dropped those probes into her tree. We analyzed the leaves, boron on the leaves. Okay, that's trace evidence, close encounter of the second kind. Close encounter of the third time when you see the entity. Okay, close encounter of the fourth kind is an abduction. Now it gets interesting because there really was only 4 and they've added some. Close encounter of the 5th kind is a contact initiated by humans, like SETI, where you get a response. That's a CE5. CE6 is where someone dies from the abduction or encounter, and a CE7 is a human-alien hybrid birth. So that's generally now there's 7 types. Some people have this Oz factor of ability to communicate with telepathy. The UN lists UFOs in their encyclopedia. It's a codified term of unidentified flying object. And ARV is an alien reproduction vehicle, something that we back engineered. Rods are a real life form, similar to what Kenneth Arnold said he saw. Exopolitics was, well, it's going to go a little longer because I'm in charge of this conference. That's all right. Stephen Bassett did not come out with the term exopolitics. That was Alfred Weber. Okay, 1994, this was interesting. North Carolina MUFON State Director George Fawcett comes out with a list of 25 things that repeat in UFO encounters. Number 6 is boron. And that's what happened in Bucks County with the Denise case. We found boron, and that's one of the main things they find in these UFO encounters. The other thing I've concluded also is that a lot of what was seen, and I think what Denise saw, was the TR-3B. Triangular craft, light on each corner. That's what she described. That's what a lot of people described over Bucks County in 2008. I kind of think that it came from our military base. Could be, but it's looking that way. National Press Club held UFO hearings in 01, 07, 10, and 13. I attended the ones in 13. Really good stuff if you listen to those. People coming forward, willing to sign affidavits in front of Congress to testify I'm telling the truth. Nobody in Congress is interested other than the retirees that we brought in and paid to sit there and host a mock congressional hearing, which was cool. I give Bassett a lot of credit. That was a really good idea and what he did. 2008, you know of the Stevensville sightings over Texas, over President Bush's ranch, where they lied about the F-16s, and MUFON got the radar. Robert Powell, who's on the board with me in MUFON, absolutely proves that there was 7 F-16s chasing this thing over the Crawford Ranch. The year started with Stevensville. It ended with the Bucks County case in 2008. Here's a couple of things happens in 2008 now. The Air Force decides they're no longer going to take UFO reports. If you call the Air Force, they say, call NORAD. NORAD will take the report. Then we figure out, why does NORAD take the report? Because they're a North American agency that's not subject to Freedom of Information Acts. You can't get anything from them. So now they're getting slick. I'm telling you, everything I've told you is going to be scrubbed over the next 20 years. You won't be able to find one of these memos or anything. They're just going to say it never existed, and they're going to erase it. So then I find a 2008 interview by James Oberg of NASA. You've probably seen him. He's always the guy that comes out and talks about UFOs. He says the Air Force would routinely pose as NASA agents on UFO investigations. So I'm saying to myself, is this the source of the MIBs, the MIBs, Men in Black? Okay? So it was really the Air Force posing as NASA agents, but they were really from the Air Force to scare you and everything for the Men in Black. June 2010, the UK closes, and you see a pattern here. The UK closes its UFO desk, and they're only going to keep reports for 30 days. Why? Because then you can't get a Freedom of Information Act. They destroy them after 30 days. NASA then also decides that they're going to hold all pictures from space for 6 months until they can analyze them. Well, what are you going to analyze them for? We had the NASA people come forward and say because they scrub any evidence off of Mars, craft, etc. Asia, South America have UFO reporting centers. I already talked about the hole punch clouds. We talked about a lot of this already. I talked about the X-37B with the space program. Here's something interesting. Radar is not configured to pick up anything that doesn't look like a plane. If it's too big, hovers, flies too fast, it just comes back as weather. It doesn't really tell them it's a UFO. They paint it as weather. Okay, since we're kind of running out of time, there's a few other things. I have some theories on what these extraterrestrials are. I have a position statement. I want to read one last thing to you before we break for lunch. This was sent to me anonymously in an envelope, just like I got an anonymous envelope for Anthony Sanchez. It was actually sent to me after we did Bill Burns' show on Dulce. We talked about it last Saturday. I got an envelope with evidence on Dulce. I gave it to Anthony. But I get this email to me, and it says here, here's how it's done. Now think of everything I just told you and think about this. This is about bin Laden, okay? Just happened. It says, here's how it's done. An article written by Richard Lardner of the Associated Press. Think about this. The top U.S. Special Operations Commander, William McRaven, ordered military files about the Navy SEAL raid on bin Laden's hideout to be purged from the Defense Department computers and sent to the CIA, where they could be more easily shielded from the public. The secret move set off no alarms in the Obama administration, even though it sidesteps federal rules and the Freedom of Information Act. An acknowledgement by Admiral McRaven of his actions was quietly removed from the final version of the Inspector General's published report. This is the reporter writing this, Associated Press. By secretly moving the records, allowed the Pentagon to tell the Associated Press it couldn't find any documents inside the Defense Department that the AP had requested 2 years ago, and this represents a new strategy for the U.S. to shield the most sensitive documents from public scrutiny. Think about UFOs and the CIA. Welcome to the new shell game of open government. The CIA has special authority to prevent the release of operational files in ways that can't be challenged in federal court. If you want to hide something, you can. Anderson Cooper says we can't, but I say you can. The Defense Department told the AP in March of 2012 it could not locate any photographs or video taken during the raid showing bin Laden's body. It also said it could not find any images of bin Laden's body on the USS Carl Vinson, the aircraft carrier where he was buried at sea. The Pentagon also said it could not find any death certificate, autopsy report of DNA, or any pre-raid materials discussing how the government planned to dispose of his body. It said it searched the files at the Pentagon Special Operations Command in Florida, the Navy Command in San Diego that controls the Carl Vinson. The Pentagon also refused to confirm or deny the existence of the helicopter maintenance logs and the performance of military gear in the raid, even though stealth helicopters that carried the SEALs into Pakistan, one of them crashed. They can get no information on that. We all know this just happened a couple of years ago. Now think about the UFO cover-up, how easy it is. And whoever sent this to me, they just sent it to me, no return address, no name, here's how it's done. Just like what I just gave Anthony Sanchez on Dulce, which we'll talk about later. That concludes it. You can get the rest of it in my book, and we'll talk later. Thank you.